to what we're going to talk about today, and kind of on a kind of corporate side, what it means and what that really looks like. All right. So first off, let's think about this from the standpoint of the corporate dilemma, right? And what I mean by that is when you think about how we're seeing the explosion of AI use today, right? From an executive kind of standpoint, it's a kind of a mixed bag, right? On the one hand, shareholders, investors, customers, definitely, CEOs and their, whoever they answer to, are being told, and they're based in this position where they have to use AI, they have to use it right now, and they want to get the best, bang for their buck. The challenge is that right now, there was an MIT study done not so long ago, but the majority of these, pilots of people using generative AI and these different types of tools are either failing or they're just not meeting financial expectations, right? And this is from the C-suite down. So this is kind of a big deal when we think about what it means to actually implement these things in real life and real time, right? So, what several executives have been kind of quoted as saying, or the thought kind of is, we have this super powerful engine. We can't really verify, all its answers or predict its behavior sometimes, right? This is a real challenge when you have to answer to boards and shareholders and people who kind of hold you accountable. And the main, one of the biggest things about this is, too, the kind of inherent black box nature, if you will, of AI. But there's really more so, it's about this kind of trust deficit, right? When we think about generative AI being used, there's a lack of full, trust that all of the things that you need to get out of it, you will get, right? And the core, the main part of that problem is really a combination of a couple of things, right? Opaque reasoning and not fully understanding the reason or the why behind how AI is used, kind of sometimes unpredictable outputs, right, where there's no real veracity, right, or explainability sometimes there, and really the biggest one is probably the lack of accountability to a certain extent. That's just, well, that's what AI said, so I guess that's what we're doing. That's can be a big challenge, right? And so if these systems hallucinate or fabricate answers with authority, like they sound correct, right, they can really erode trust, not just in the AI itself, but also in critical business systems and business decisions, quite honestly. And so we're left with this powerful engine that we can't verify or predict. So, what do we do about that? And what do we kind of, that's what we have. So what do we want? Is kind of the next question, right? And I think this question fundamentally, it comes down to kind of asking, is kind of balancing the difference between AI versus AI, right? So the artificial intelligence, if you will, versus what we would consider, actual intelligence. And so what I mean by that, to kind of distinguish those kind of two, pots, if you will, those two things is, on the one hand, we have this, what we know and we're familiar with AI, right? So this is the artificial intelligence that we've seen, machine learning, deep learning, all the things, right? LLMs and GenAI and all the stuff we hear about. But, we have to kind of compare and contrast and think about that when we use this term of, intelligence, right? What does quote unquote actual intelligence look like, right? When we think about actual intelligence, we're usually thinking about the kind of human to human thought process, right? And there's a lot that goes on in there. There's ethical reasoning, there's learning, there's understanding, there's all kind of nuance, right? There's the intelligence of, someone who reads a lot of books, right? And knows the entire, say, encyclopedia, if you still use encyclopedias or you know what those are, right? It's maybe every Wikipedia page, for example, versus, right, the intelligence, quote unquote, or the mathematical power, if you will, of someone who is just very good at, say, using their body, maybe an athlete who has such great muscle memory, right? A combination of being able to do these amazing physical things on a basketball court, a tennis court, golf course, whatever, but also knows and can do these calculations, this breakneck speed of, if I throw the ball at this angle, this is what I'll take for me to get it to go into this hoop, or to correctly go far enough to get into the hole, down the field when playing golf, whatever it is, right? Hit this baseball, whatever. But all those things kind of come from a lot more than just, here's a bunch of facts, right? There's the reasons, and also, what do you do and how do you do it right? And so at the end of the day, right, this is what we actually want, right? And so the conversation is really, how do we get there? And so what I would kind of start with is think about it in terms of this intelligence hierarchy, if you will, right? And usually that, in the way we kind of start, and we'll kind of take the corporate route, or the, kind of how computers do. We start with some kind of data, right? And then with that data, we kind of have some information, right? And then ideally some, knowledge. And then, what comes after that, right? This is how we get to that intelligence or the brain that we're thinking about. We think about these kind of corporate situations, right? Um, and so this is adapted from a book on management in enterprise systems. But really, what does that mean when we talk about this knowledge, this data, and this information, and how do we get there from where we're at and kind of this starting point, right? So one way to think about this slightly differently is if we think about the data, the knowledge, and the information, but more so in terms of actually applying some context to it, right? Meaning that what is what are the things that we actually need or we're actually looking at, right? So we start with maybe just some basic facts, right, about this. That's what we're talking about when we say data, right? When we kind of go and talk about this, add this concept, the concept like relevance. That's what we're actually doing with this information. And then, once we kind of can get to the point of context, then that's where we're really talking about what to do with that knowledge, right? And then, of course, there's whatever comes next from there. And, as we kind of think about how to put all that together, I think the real question that we want to ask is, how do we go from, data to information to knowledge, and why are these things different, right? From just basic facts to relevance to some context and into that, next level of intelligence, if you will, or what comes from that, right? And what does that mean for us? Well, first question we can ask is retrieval augmented generation, right? RAG, right? Is this a solution? Can this get us to our corporate brain, to our intelligence, right? And to start with, let's think about like how RAG works, right? So, first there's, it's kind of the first level of that kind of, hierarchy we talked about. Because you start with some essentially the data part, right? You start with some, whether it's files or documents, some database. Then when we apply RAG, this kind of vector search stuff happens. We try to retrieve that data using these different methods. And essentially, what happens is you kind of get this a de facto file cabinet, if you will, right? Nothing inherently wrong with that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we realize that it doesn't really solve our problem or connect to what we actually want or need in our scenario, right? And a lot of that's because there's no reasoning with RAG, right? As the the very famous popular Neo4j manifesto about graph RAG talks about, right? There's search, but there's not really a lot of reasoning, right? They talk about blue links, things like that. So an example would be like the kind of the customer chunking thing, right? Meaning that if you have like customer A, right, and you want to know, why did customer A's churn risk increase after we have upgraded product B? Well, if you got a bunch of documents, this is what you're going to get back. A RAG will tell you, well, I had 5 documents and about customer A, and here's some product manuals for customer B, and that's the information, right? You're kind of starting to get there. You have the data, that's the facts and stuff. You have the things, but it's not really knowledge, if you will, right? And so part of that is where we're getting this trust deficit than enterprise systems, right? So again, we have this parallel hallucinations. We know there's a black box that's happened, and that's a real huge barrier to success. And so what we need something more, right? So a RAG is a decent first step. It fails. It just doesn't give us those contexts and those relationships that we realize we really, really need for that next level. And so to get to this actual intelligence, what we actually need is a brain, right? We need a brain and not just a file cabinet. And so that's where we're at. We're talking about this kind of corporate brain, right? These knowledge graphs, this understanding. And this is where things like, Neo4j and the graph database comes in, because now what you have is this opportunity to combine, in some ways, the best of both worlds, right? You can get the same, data and your facts, but you also have information and some context to it, the same way you would get with the kind of vector search that comes with graph. But now you can also get an additional layer with that reasoning, right? Because now you're not just searching for documents, right? You're actually going a step beyond, and you're adding context and trying to figure out, okay, what's actually happening here. You can really map those precise relationships, and those relationships, that's what really gives that reasoning for this is why this is happening, this is what's happening, and this is essentially what needs to happen next. Right? And so that's really kind of where we want to go, right? And the kind of goal of kind of putting these things together. So again, kind of going back to our pyramid here, going from data to information to knowledge, and then seeing we can figure out what's next, right? That we have this, the basics, right? These LLMs, that's kind of what we can do with our data to really turn those, that data and make those facts usable, right? That's one of the powers of AI in the space we're in, right? And now with adding like some kind of vector search function, vector databases, and RAG, traditional RAG at least, we get to turn that information into something that's relevant, right? Here are all the information about customer A or customer B, which is fine, which is great. But the real, corporate brain side of it, and what we really need is the knowledge graphs that basically tell us that, hey, for this information, here's the context, here's what it means, here are the relationships, here's the mapping that makes it really important, and that's how we get knowledge from that. So, the main argument that I have, and I think what's kind of add to the conversation is that enough, right? And so even if we have a really smart brain, right, and we have all the knowledge graphs, I think it's important to think about, is that enough for where we're going, right? And it's like, Gandhi, love this quote by him about science without humanity and the pursuit of, everything, and really it's more about asking not so much just what can we do, but what should we do? And so even if we have this ability to have more reason, to have more information, and have, these knowledge graphs, these things that can really work for us and help us to kind of climb that ladder of how to get to this true kind of corporate brain and this kind of corporate intelligence, we have facts, we have relevance, we have context. It's really not enough if we don't also have, some type of ethical lens or some kind of scaffolding on top of that, that also would include, what we kind of should do, right? So what I would, propose, and what I think would be, makes sense, is really this concept of what I would call what's called virtue ethics, right? And there's been a number of studies that talk about kind of what this is, but it's really, intelligence alone, right? Without, essentially guardrails and conscious and this kind of other layer on top of it doesn't really give us what we need. And it could in some ways be harmful, destructive, or really hurt us if we don't know or don't have a context about what to do with those relationships, if it's not part of the graph and the system we're building. So, for our kind of AI corporate brain, when you're thinking about it, there really needs to be some kind of, moral compass lane or some kind of, compliance. And that's comes from a lot of different places, right? Everything from compliance rules to, societal norms to just even as individuals, what should we do? What shouldn't we do? How does this hurt people, or not hurt people, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think the compass shouldn't be necessarily just a rigid set of rules and regulations, but we have to kind of try our best to see, can we use that as some kind of like actual, framework that would actually help with grounding all of our, AI activities in a lane related to the ethical components, right? And so what I think would be the best kind of method, situation / path moving forward would really be a combination of knowledge graphs plus virtue ethics, right? And this idea, what I came up with, was called this H.E.V.I.D.S model. And I'll go into as much detail as I can. Basically, when you think about the different components, harmony, ethics, veracity, integrity, discernment, and safeguards, all of these are kind of some basic definitions, but actually give us a framework and a grounding around, can we ensure, or at least attempt to make sure, that in all of our activities, everything we build and what we design, and how we're using AI models, our AI systems, and everything at every level of this kind of intelligence hierarchy, if you will, are we doing what we can to make sure that we're looking at these aspects, right? Are we trying to foster communication, or cooperation and understanding with this action that this thing is taking, right? Is that part of the decision points that are happening at each level of that, graph, that map, that conversation, that AI action, right? Are we embedding some of those moral principles into the code, right? I mean, there are a number of, especially now, models that come with some type of guardrails or constitutional AI, right? These are important, but that kind of constitutional AI or some piece that embeds, here are the moral principles, here are our companies, what we believe in, here's our, what we do, and actually have that embedded to, the code at the code level or the development level is a very big deal, right? I think one of the other things that happens is, and when I talk about the idea of veracity is, kind of there's, we just saw different models come out about like, Sora 2 and deepfakes, things like that. Can we battle those, right? So, having the ability to kind of combat misinformation at scale is a huge component of what's important, especially moving forward with graphs and things like that. One of the benefits, quite honestly, of knowledge graphs in particular, especially when they're combined with RAG and relationships and at scale leverage LLMs and that kind of vector databases, is that veracity, that kind of truth layer is kind of built in. Which is one of the wonderful things about us using Graph to do any kind of AI database, right? Making sure again that truthfulness, that trustworthiness in these systems are consistently, doing that. Again, another benefit of continuous kind of graph use, or making sure that you have a robust enough system where that kind of graphical database or that mapping is happening throughout at each layer of the both the network, but also of your database, right? And really, when you start putting all these things together, it really does give you a chance to kind of really augment human judgment and human discernment, right? To make sure that we as humans who should be in the loop and part of that kind of learning path, helping us make better decisions, right? And not just making decisions on our behalf, but helping us and aiding us in the decisions that we as humans make to do these things. And then finally, when you kind of put all that together with the right types of guardrails to make sure that no kind of physical or emotional or harm in general comes to the people, the individuals, the companies, the entities, if you will, right? I think that other layer adds a huge component to what it actually means and what's needed when you're trying to do any kind of knowledge graph work. So again, this kind of intellectual or kind of information highway, right? This whole hierarchy. A couple things, right? I think it's important to look at the LLMs and the data that we're talking about. Obviously, the information and trying to make sure you get relevant data is super important. But then, obviously, the biggest benefit of having knowledge graphs and GraphRag is the ability to actually add context and relationships to all your data and information. I believe that it's very important in that next kind of level to also add a layer of kind of virtue ethics, right? And understand that in addition to the basics of data, information, knowledge, LLMs, and GraphRag, having this kind of virtue ethics layer, right, gives us wisdom, right? Knowledge with an ethical lens that we can say, make truly better decisions and really understand what's going on. And really, this is more of a corporate brain scenario, right? Where you're an actual brain, where you have the intelligence plus you have the ethics. And I think that when we apply these principles throughout how we are designing, how we're using, and how we're working with, interacting with AI, in the future, I think that's where you really get the the wins, so to speak. And this is a kind of win for everybody, right? And so in terms of like how that happens, I think the path forward is in terms of how to combine the intelligence plus the ethics and really get to trustworthy AI and this kind of corporate brain that we're talking about. I think it's a couple of things. One, assessing the current AI capabilities of the organization, of the team, and all involved to really identify what are the gaps in trust? Not just technology question, it's really a trust question, right? Do you trust your AI systems? Do you trust your data? Do you trust your information? Do your employees trust your data and information? Do your customers trust your data, your information, your knowledge? If the answer is no to any of those, that's something that needs to be worked out, right? The second thing you can do, and this is where I think Neo4j and the the knowledge graph and all the capabilities here are so important, is mapping, right? Actually mapping out the knowledge that you have, mapping out your data, mapping out your information, mapping it and turning those facts into actual knowledge. And then I think once you do that, then when you can integrate some of these principles of actual, this kind of H.E.V.I.D.S framework, having harmony, ethics, veracity, and all these things into what you're doing, I think then you have the potential to actually embed those into both the architecture from the ground up. That will actually help to be able to deploy these kind of GraphRag solutions in a way that's both, efficient, effective, but also ethical and trustworthy. And I think that's kind of what's really, at stake, and what's I can think the next best steps for us all as we move forward. But with that being said, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it. If you would like to reach out to me, please feel free. My email and my Twitter and my website are all here, as well as a link to my book about a lot of these kind of subjects if you're interested. So please feel free.